Okay, well, Jeannie and Dana, thank you so much for being here today. We're here to talk about an issue that is unfortunately ongoing on college campuses, which is sexual assault and the best approaches to stop it. So I guess first, for people who don't know, because we don't all kind of follow this stuff as religiously as you guys do, what are some of the prevailing standards around sexual assault on college campuses? So I've heard things about affirmative consent, which is where you get a yes at every step. I've heard about anything that's unwelcome. So what are sort of most colleges doing, and what is the best thing for them to be doing?
So one of the reasons that college campuses have been involved so heavily in the area of sexual assault is that in 2011, the Department of Education, Office of Civil Rights, told the colleges and universities that Title IX, which prohibits sex discrimination in education, also covers sexual violence, because sexual violence is a form of sexual harassment, and then therefore sexual harassment, which is a form of sex discrimination, means that colleges have a responsibility to address and to prevent and to adjudicate cases of sexual violence. Now, but they did leave completely to the colleges how to define what sexual violence is. And as we know, there's a whole spectrum between criminal definitions of rape and sexual assault, unwanted sexual touching, all the way to sexual harassment, which may not be sexual violence, but it is sexual harassment. And the most common definition of sexual harassment is the one that exists in the courts, which is that it's unwelcome conduct of a sexual nature, and that it creates a hostile environment. And that is the standard that many colleges have, that it's unwelcome conduct of a sexual nature creates a hostile environment. And what's unwelcome conduct? Sometimes that's defined, as it is at my school, Harvard Law School, as conduct that is unrequested or uninvited and is regarded as undesirable or offensive. So that is one standard that is out there that many schools are using, but there's also lots of other standards, like unwelcomeness, unwillingness. There's some schools use consent definitions that are closer to criminal definitions. So I think there's a lot of chaos out there right now about how to define sexual assault and sexual violence. And one of the sort of smaller issues in that is how to define consent. What is consent? Is it saying yes every step of the way? Is it unwilling? Is it lack of consent? Is unwillingness? Or is it that you have to communicate willingness, or that you have to agree? And I think that that's a debate that's really, really very much alive. Yesterday I was at the American Law Institute's annual meeting where we were discussing the model penal code. It's a model code for states to look at when they're deciding their own criminal laws, and it's about sexual assault. And the 500-member body that was there yesterday and met decided to reject affirmative consent for the criminal model penal code.
And why is that? Did they just think it was too strict?
I think that in general, of course, it's a very large body, so it's hard to know to pin down exactly why. But I think that the arguments that were heard were things like unmanageability. What does it mean to communicate? Does it have to be verbal, or can it be nonverbal? What happens if you don't communicate anything, but in fact you were willing and wanted to go along with the sexual activity, and people felt that it would be in line with the kind of overcriminalization that we see in our country of all kinds of behaviors, and basically adding the sexual area to the whole brush of overcriminalization and mass incarceration that we see.
And what did they recommend instead of affirmative consent, I guess?
They are adopting a standard that says consent is a person's willingness to engage in the activity. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, that will be evaluated, consent will be evaluated according to a standard that looks at whether the person who's being accused had the right state of mind to be guilty of a crime. So, for example, if one is reckless with respect to the other person's willingness, that could be a guilty state of mind, or intentional with respect to that other person's willingness. But so it would be both, the idea of willingness coupled with the mental state of the person who's being accused, and they would have to have a guilty mental state in order to be convicted.
Oh, interesting. And Dana, do you approve of that affirmative consent has sort of been rejected as being the best standard, it seems like?
So what I'm seeing on college campuses are really three different standards. One is no means no, so that means that it falls on the person receiving sexual conduct to say, no, I don't want this. And that's, considered sort of antiquated and old and hopefully is on the out. The second is the yes means yes affirmative consent model, which says that the person initiating conduct at each stage needs to get an affirmative yes. And then, as Professor Sook mentioned, the third is the welcomeness standard, which asks if conduct is objectively and subjectively unwelcome. What I'm seeing is a lot of students demanding that affirmative consent, yes means yes standard. But I actually think that that is due more to a lack of familiarity with other options. I think that students know that there's a no means no standard, and they know there's a yes means yes standard. And obviously, yes means yes is and sounds so much better. But in reality, there's this third standard, welcomeness, which I think is actually just as protective as affirmative consent and is actually better for a couple reasons.
Oh, I see. Okay. And how do you judge welcomeness? Like, how do you actually figure that out in the aftermath?
Yeah, that's a terrific question. Because on one hand, you could say, well, welcomeness, is it about just how the person who's the one who is considered the victim experienced it? Like whether he or she thought it was welcome or not? How do we know? We have to then look into his or her subjective state of mind. Well, it's not just that. Welcomeness also involves a set of objective or external considerations about how all the circumstances, the totality of the circumstances might appear. And so if someone inside thought this is unwelcome, but acted as if it were, that might not be a case of unwelcomeness, depending on all the other circumstances. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. And so for people who are fortunate enough not to have had this happen to them, who may not know anyone who has had this happen to them, and might have maybe a antiquated or stereotypical notion of what campus sexual assault looks like, what are some myths that really deserve a debunking here?
There are so many. One is that this idea that false reporting is astronomically high. In reality, study after study has shown that false reporting rates for rape are just the same as for any other crime. Another is that those students suffering the highest victimization rates on campus are cisgender women, when in reality, we know that transgender and gender nonconforming students suffer even higher victimization rates than cis women. And then a last one that I'll throw out is this myth that the police are doing it better than schools. And that's just not true for all sorts of reasons. We know that only 3 in every 100 perpetrators will ever spend a day in jail. That's obviously a low prosecution and conviction rate. But we also know that police are really just as likely to disbelieve and blame victims as school officials are. And what's more, for many victims, particularly those who are of color or undocumented, going to the cops can be really dangerous and often results in them being criminalized rather than the person who hurt them.
And so I want to get into, there's a lot of situations here that I think people could have different takes on and might seem sort of complicated for anyone dealing with these issues to figure out. So recently one at Brandeis that I read about where a student was charged with 3 counts of sexual misconduct for things that included waking up his longtime boyfriend at the time that they were dating with a kiss. Without getting, obviously the person was sleeping at the time, so he didn't get an affirmative yes. So are situations like that, when we read about that, I feel like it sparks this feeling of, well, we've gone too far. We've crossed the line into protecting victims too much. So are situations like that sort of a rare occurrence? Are they sort of a distracting thing that happens often? Where should we kind of compartmentalize that?
I don't know, the specifics of exactly what happened between those students at Brandeis, but I can say that I don't see this happening, pervasively across the board. That certainly doesn't mean that it's not happening, but we certainly have lots of evidence of the opposite happening, namely people perpetrating rape and being allowed to stay on campus, and consequently, their victims often dropping out because they don't feel safe being on the same campus as their perpetrator. So this might be a sign that we have different campuses doing wildly different things, and all of that should concern us. But what we really need is to get a sense of what is happening on the ground, not just at one particular campus, but across the board. And to do that, we need schools to be publishing data on what kinds of cases are moving through an adjudicatory process, when are findings of responsibility being issued, and what kinds of sanctions are being applied. And that information should be non-identifying to preserve the confidentiality of the parties involved, but it certainly needs to track the racial and gender identities of both the accused student and the accusing student, so we can get a better sense of really what's going on the ground here.
Would you agree with that?
Yes, largely I would, and I would say that one of the things that currently feels pathological about how things are working on college campuses, that we have both the under-inclusion problem of people who are actually sexually assaulted not getting attention and not getting vindication, and we also have an over-inclusion problem, which is exemplified by the case that you mentioned. And I do not think that either is uncommon. I think that both are actually happening right now. And it happens in part because of the thing we just finished talking about, which is the overbroad definitions of the offense, where it is actually, if you take the overbroad definitions, it is actually an offense to wake someone up with a kiss. It may actually be an offense, as in that Brandeis case, also to stare at one's boyfriend's body while showering together. That was one of the things that he was found responsible as sexual misconduct. So if you have a broad definition, then it is going to actually capture all of these cases, and it's actually going to be legitimate in the system to charge these people with sexual misconduct, but you're also, by focusing on those kinds of things, you're diverting energy from the real problem, which is sexual assault. And I think that that's a real problem that we face right now.
Yeah. Another issue that is sort of on the flip side of that almost, which that I've been reading a lot about lately, is these situations that, especially religious colleges that have honor codes, there have been a few incidences of women who, I think they were all women who were assaulted, but then they were sort of investigated for an honor code violation before their abuser or attacker was investigated. And of course, I'm just wondering whether that is something that happens at secular universities, whether there's any victim blaming, maybe not in the context of an honor code, but how big of an issue is that right now?
Sure. I think that it is a particularly big problem at religious institutions where students who are raped are suffering punishment for drinking, for using drugs, for being queer, for having same-sex sex. But it is also a problem elsewhere. So an anonymous student just came forward about her experience at Spelman being raped by a Morehouse student. She said that when she tried to report at Spelman, she was blamed for drinking. She was asked what she was wearing, and she received no justice or support whatsoever. So I think it is a problem across the board, and schools are starting to change. But the ones who are incentivized most to change are the ones who are getting covered on the front page of the New York Times.
Yeah.
I think the reason the religious schools are a particularly salient example of this is because they do put on par the offenses that we're talking about, the non-drinking policy, the no sexual assault policy, the policy of extramarital sex. All of those are on the same level as offenses. And so are you supposed to say one person gets punished for one offense, but the other person doesn't get punished for the other offense if both of them come to light to the university? And on regular sort of secular college campuses, we also face that problem which is that, universities also don't want people to abuse drugs. And there are other kinds of offenses. And when you see a situation where let's say there's a situation where everyone used cocaine and then one person got sexually assaulted by another. It is the case that in many places, in many universities, you'll say, well, there's amnesty for the person who was victimized by sexual assault. But if they were not victimized by sexual assault, they would not have amnesty because everybody actually abused, drugs. So I think there's a delicate issue of the fact that one is victimized means that one doesn't have responsibility for the other things one might have done. And that may, in fact, policy-wise, be the wise thing to do because we consider sexual assault so important and it's so important to incentivize people to report it that we want to give people amnesty. But I don't think it is an open and shut, easy issue.
Right. So it's like, how do you weigh that, the breaking of the law, and in two different ways, yeah. And so, so there's been a movement on some campuses then to just refer, assault investigations to the police automatically. What are some of the pros and cons of that, and what impact would that have on the victims?
So we think it's a natural response. We think cops, we think safety, we think we're going to put offenders behind bars. But it's actually has a lot of unintended consequences and can be really dangerous. Survivors tell me again and again that if their reports to school officials were automatically turned over to law enforcement without their consent, that they would actually then tell no one at all. And so that means not only that students would lose out on the kinds of accommodations and services that their school can provide if they report, but it also means the school has no idea about perpetrators on campus.
So I think it's very appealing to a lot of people to say, these are really serious crimes and you refer them to the police. What are the schools doing mucking around with these kangaroo courts? I think that's a very easy position to take, but it's just so much more complicated than that. And the problem with the police is that, first of all, in a lot of parts of our criminal justice system, people have discretion whether to report to the police, and we're basically saying to the universities, you're going to take the autonomy away from the person who's experienced this and make them basically have their cases go through the criminal system. I don't know of other places where we would think that that was acceptable, except in these areas like domestic violence, where in the criminal system we have mandatory arrest and mandatory prosecution. And I think that's where this push is coming from, that we've seen these other areas that have been influenced by feminist law reform. We have pushed law enforcement to think of these as mandatory areas where you have to go forward even if the victim doesn't want it. And we're seeing the same idea being applied in the campus sexual assault context. And I think that these are very problematic in many contexts, including in the criminal context, but because essentially it takes the decision out of the hands of the person who's experienced the crime to go forward. And for the same reasons that you might be against mandatory arrest and domestic violence, you might also have trouble with it in the context of mandatory referral by the university.
So I'm sorry to take this totally down to basic level, but for people who don't know, what are some of the reasons that a victim might not want to go through the criminal justice system?
So many reasons. It is a public process. A lot of victims still feel a lot of shame around being assaulted, and so having to go forward and have your family members know that this happened to you can be a real deterrent. Some survivors are undocumented, and so going to the police can risk deportation or being put in a detention facility. Survivors of color, I mean, we're seeing like in one half of this country is having a conversation about police brutality, and then the other half of the country is like, why do survivors of color not want to go to the police? When I think it's actually pretty obvious given this other conversation. So those are some of the reasons.
I think that in general, victims of crimes, not just sexual assault, would have reason to think, is there a way that I can get through this without involving the police and the nightmare of the criminal justice system and how it will upend my life and change everything and so it's not just a sexual assault issue, but Dana's right that the particular shame and stigma that might attach in our society to the issue would intensify that problem. I think that there are actually rational reasons for people to avoid criminal justice involvement or any court involvement, that whatever problems they're having in their lives, whether it's a divorce or somebody stole something from you or whatever, you might think that the ideal thing is to deal with it and not go to the police. And I think that that would apply with great force in the sexual assault context.
And then there's the question of whether offenders should leave college. Some universities are actually considering putting something on their transcript that they were punished for sexual misconduct on their transcript, and a lot of people have said that that is, a lot like a scarlet letter almost, except that the scarlet letter was able to be taken off. So what is sort of your reaction to that? Do you feel like it's like a permanent kind of mark of shame, or do you feel like that's a necessary thing for someone who does something so serious?
I think in a country where we routinely find acceptable that even after someone's convicted of a crime and unpunished, that afterwards, for the rest of their life, they will have a mark as a sex offense, at someone who's committed a sex offense, that will follow them for the rest of their lives and affect where they can live, where they can work, where they can go. The fact that we accept that readily as a country, that this exists and that's just the way it is, means that it's probably, for a lot of people, not that much of a stretch to say if you did something on campus and you were found responsible for it, and it was a sexual thing, then at the very least there should be a mark on your transcript that follows you so that you can't just go to another school and have it not be known. Now, I'm against sex offender registries, and I think that that is excessive as a way of dealing with this category of crime. And I similarly feel about the transcript marks that if someone has been found responsible, the discipline has been done, which is that they've been either suspended or expelled, they should have a second chance to go and enroll in a school, and perhaps the educational function that we have, which is the discipline, is supposed to be the university's educational function. It's pedagogical as well, and not actually supposed to be punitive. That person should be able to say, listen, I was found responsible, now I'm going to try to do something else that can, make my life go forward. And we are always in danger of people reoffending and doing things again, but that's also true of people who offend in high school, it's also true of people who offend in elementary school, and it's also true of people who offend as adults. And so I think that that's just a problem that we have as a society, that people who did something once before may do it again. On the other hand, how do we want to respond to it? By basically saying your chances for life are drastically reduced, and basically you can't gain admission to another institution of higher education. I think that that's an overreach.
You look like you might be.
Yeah, first of all, I completely agree with Professor Sook, but I am sympathetic to people, particularly survivors, concerns about the person who hurt them transferring to another school and doing the same thing to someone else. This is personal for me. The person who raped me in college transferred to another university without a notation on his transcript. He graduated in a heartbeat and is out living his life, and I worry every day that he is assaulting someone else. I know he assaulted someone before me, he assaulted me, it may happen again. But that said, I don't think that transcript notations are the answer. And I think that in part for the reasons of justice and fairness and our feminist commitments that Professor Sook outlined, but I also think that there are and will be unintended consequences for survivors. So I worry that survivors, particularly those who are in abusive relationships with the person who assaulted them, will be less likely to come forward about the assault because they are worried that it will cause sort of this permanent mark to adhere to someone who hurt them, but who they also have feelings about. We see that really commonly with survivors of intimate partner violence. I also worry, will adjudicators be less likely to find a perpetrator responsible for assault if they know that the sanction is so high and lasting? We see this all the time in the criminal context where when mandatory minimum sanctions are instituted or raised, prosecutors are less likely to prosecute and juries are less likely to convict because they know that that lasting mark is there. And if perpetrators aren't found responsible, because of this, that has a real impact on a victim who then has to stay on the same campus with someone who hurt her and has her education impaired as a result.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly a very thorny issue, as we've seen. Well, Jeannie, Dana, thank you so much for being here today. We really appreciate it.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah.